A nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. That's how Thomas Jefferson said we should respond to any federal act that goes beyond the limits of the Constitution. Otherwise, doing so is setting up a precedent for what he called unlimited power. But here's the thing. Jefferson wasn't inventing something new when he wrote that in 1798 in response to the Adams administration and the hated Alien and Sedition Act. Or Sedition Acts. He was reminding us of principles that were at the heart of the American Revolution for decades, ideas that people used to actively resist tyranny and the largest government in the history of the world, at least until that point. And so today, those principles are really more important than ever. On this episode, stick around to learn all about it, but first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, September 30th, 2024. Hope you had an awesome weekend, and I appreciate you being here with me. But let's kick it off with Thomas Jefferson's draft or fair copy for the Kentucky resolutions, written sometime before October 10th or October of 1798. And he put it like this: in cases of an abuse of the delegated powers, the members of the general government being chosen by the people, a change by the people would be the constitutional remedy. But where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. So many points that we can make just on this one statement here. First of all, it's not just a good idea. Nullification isn't just a good idea to try after everything else. It's not something that you just use once in a while. It's something that you use immediately as soon as they go beyond the limits of their powers. Because, as Jefferson wrote, he said, this commonwealth is determined, as it doubts not its co-states are, to submit to undelegated and consequently unlimited powers in no man or body of men on earth. In Jefferson's view, as soon as you establish the precedent that they can go beyond the limits that they're given in a constitution, there's no difference between them doing anything beyond those limits because they have the legal authority, in essence, at that point, or the acquiescence of the people to do whatever they want. And so he says, anytime they go beyond those limits, a nullification is the rightful remedy. And vote the bums out is when they're doing stuff within the bounds of the Constitution, but, well, they're abusing those powers. They're not doing a good job with them. Anyways, he continued. He said, every state has a natural right, in cases not within the compact, to nullify of their own authority all assumptions of power by others within their limits. And we know in this context, he's not referencing state governments. When we're talking about states in this, and James Madison discussed it as well in his report of 1800, we're talking about the people of the several states in their highest sovereign capacity. So the people of each state in their own authority have the ability and the right, the natural right, that they don't have to get permission from the government that they helped create in order to keep that government in check. And Jefferson continued with this: without this right, they would be under the dominion, absolute and unlimited, of whosoever might exercise this right of judgment for them. So for Thomas Jefferson, the people who created the Constitution and delegated powers to create the federal government, or the general government in his phrasing here, those are the people who have the final say over whether their agent has gone beyond the limits that they have delegated to it. Now, Jefferson himself had been advocating this type of principle, these same things, declaring acts null and void at least as far back as 1774. Now, certainly the principles behind that were even further back as well. But in his summary view of the rights of British America, a very famous document, at least it should be, written in 1774, he definitely used terms like a nullity. We're declaring them null and void. And I covered that in some detail just a few weeks ago in another episode, Null and Void, Thomas Jefferson's 1774 Radical Declaration. Now, in it, he actually went through a list of British encroachments and usurpations. In essence, this is possibly how he got the job writing the Declaration of Independence, because he already put together a long list of grievances, what they called encroachments. So encroachments on the rights and liberties of the people, including the right to local self-government, and usurpations. That's an exercise of power by government not authorized by government. Injuries and usurpations, abuses and usurpations. These are ways that was phrased in the Declaration of Independence. So he went through this long list, and it wasn't even complete. And then he continued with this: but that we do not point out to His Majesty the injustice of these acts, with intent to rest on that principle the cause of their nullity. So he's saying, yeah, these things all cause problems, and here's the issues with them. But the reason that they're null, the reason that they are considered a nullity, is not because they have bad pragmatic or political results, but because you have no authority to exercise these powers in the first place. And he continued, but to show that experience confirms the propriety of those political principles which exempt us from the jurisdiction of the British Parliament. You have no authority over us at all. And he said, the true ground on which we declare these acts void is that the British Parliament has no right to exercise authority over us. Now, certainly this was different under the unwritten British Constitution, but their understanding and Jefferson's understanding was as soon as government goes beyond the limits that you believe it has, and everyone had this understanding, really, all the revolutionaries supported this view, and I'll give a few other examples as well. Those acts are automatically void, and it's just up to someone to make them void in practice. Of course, you can ask the people who try to implement it to stop doing what they were never supposed to do in the first place. That's not really an awesome strategy. But anyways, Jefferson continued. Here back to 1798. He said, whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. No different than his position that he took in 1774, a very popular, a very prominent document, Summary View of the Rights of British America, repeating that same view in the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. And this idea that acts are void, we can go back to what we can call the beginning of the controversy between the colonies and Great Britain. 1760, 1761, of course, we look further back from that as well, but generally the historians of that time, of the Revolution, they understood things to kind of start around there, or the Stamp Act crisis, for example, in 1765. But if we go back to 1761, James Otis Jr., in his very famous and powerful multi-hour arguments against the writs of assistance, basically warrantless search and seizures, he took the same position. An act against the Constitution is void. Now, of course, the British didn't agree with this type of principle, and James Madison said this was the fundamental principle on which our independence was declared, was that we thought there was a line in the sand, and then when they went beyond that line in the sand, their acts were void, and they thought, well, they could do whatever the hell they want, and that was the conflict. So James Otis Jr. kicked this off pretty firmly. An act against the Constitution is void. And we see similar arguments during the ratification debates over the Constitution. Here's Oliver Ellsworth, who ended up being the third Chief Justice of the United States, considered one of the top legal minds at the time of the founding. Here he is in the Connecticut Ratifying Convention, 1788, with the same kind of view as James Otis Jr. in 1761, as Thomas Jefferson in 1774, Jefferson again in 1798. If they make a law which the Constitution does not authorize, it is void. And Roger Sherman took the same position in 1787 during the ratification debates. All acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void. Now, of course, Sherman added the strategic element to this as well. He said, nor could they be enforced contrary to the sense of a majority of the states, recognizing that even though you point out to government that it shouldn't be doing what it's doing, it's still going to try to do what it shouldn't do because it wants to get away with what it wants to get away with. And ultimately, it's going to keep trying to enforce it. And as long as, to Sherman, a majority of the states said, well, we're not going to participate in the enforcement of this, we're not going to help you out, they're not going to be able to pull it off. And so that's why it's so important for the people of the several states to refuse to comply so they can nullify. Now, we can go back to the Stamp Act as well with these principles of nullification, of declaring acts void. And I think it's Almost ironic that John Adams took the same kind of position that Thomas Jefferson did during the Revolution, and then he was the guy who signed the Alien and Sedition Acts into law in 1798, and Jefferson used those same principles against him. We saw similar things against Jefferson in his second term and against Madison when he was in office as well. But this is kind of the nature of power, I guess. Everyone is corrupt. But here's how John Adams put it in his arguments in December of 1765. He said, "The Stamp Act, I take it, is utterly void and of no binding force upon us, for it is against our rights as men and our privileges as Englishmen." So John Adams is making taking the legal position that the Stamp Act is utterly void, just like Thomas Jefferson said in response to these Alien and Sedition Acts that John Adams signed into law 3 decades later. He said the Stamp Act was made where we are in no sense represented. Therefore, no more binding upon us than an act which should oblige us to destroy 1/2 of our species. Using a little hyperbole to hype this thing up, but that's how John Adams put it in December of 1765. And when something's void, you're not bound to obey it. And that's the position that the founding generation, the old revolutionaries, took over and over and over. I often cite Patrick Henry in his great Virginia Resolves against the Stamp Act earlier that year, May of 1765. He specifically said that, well, and he was specifically talking about internal taxes, but this could absolutely be applied to any British act or any government act that goes beyond its limits. He's taking the position that as soon as you do that, as soon as you try to tax us in areas where you're not allowed to tax us, you're not authorized by our Constitution, by our charter, by our agreement, by our history, our tradition. He said, the people are not bound to yield obedience, period. Mike Meharry puts it like this. Jefferson, in his summary view then, laid out his argument, this is 1774, in a very logical fashion, starting with the fact that the American colonists were, quote, free inhabitants of the British dominions in Europe and possessed a right which nature has given to all men. In other words, to go establish a new society. This is right from John Locke, that if you decide you don't like the society in, you can love it or leave it. That's kind of the mentality. And so Jefferson's saying, well, our ancestors decided they wanted to leave it. And they left it, and they took great risk. And they came all the way over here to the wilderness across a huge ocean, very dangerous situation, and we created our own system. We loved it or left it. And he said, Mike says he pointed out that the original settlers of North America set up societies, as Jefferson put it, under such laws and regulations as to them shall seem most likely to promote public happiness. So they created their own societies. They left the one that they were in. They risked their lives to do it. They came to a new place and they set up their own system. Jefferson continued. He said that settlements having been thus effected in the wilds of America, the emigrants thought proper to adopt that system of laws under which they had hitherto lived in the mother country. So they're like, well, we can create a similar system here, but it's our voluntary choice to do it. We aren't saying we're acquiescing to whatever you decide to do over there. You can't even understand how things are over here and the needs of where government should be involved or should get out of the way, etc. He said, so they decided to adopt that system of laws and to continue their union with her by submitting themselves to the same common sovereign, who was thereby made the central link connecting the several parts of the empire, thus newly multiplied. So, in essence, what he's saying is that there was a voluntary connection. It was not something that was forced upon the people. They left the system and decided to stay connected in some ways. And Meharry said he went on to insist that the colonies were, quote, erected into distinct and independent governments. So they created their own system. As such, they retained most powers, while the mother country was limited to exercising only a few specific functions. Sounds pretty similar to the system that they created under the Articles of Confederation, and then more broadly under the Constitution for the United States. Whether you love or hate any of these documents, the system, the general concept, the foundational principle behind it, as Thomas Jefferson called the 10th Amendment to the foundation to the Constitution, it's because it's a system where they only have certain powers delegated to them, and everything else is reserved to the people of the several states to decide how they want to do in each state, up to them. And Mike says this idea was carried over to the U.S. constitutional system, with the states maintaining sovereignty, that's final authority, with a general government delegated just a few specific powers. So Jefferson was really arguing that under the British system, the unwritten British Constitution, the colonists effectively had a right to local self-government. It really was a system. It was, a lot of gray areas, but it was a system of federalism, really. Now, here's Jefferson again in 1798, these Principles of 98, against the Alien and Sedition Acts, Kentucky resolutions. He kicked it off with this same principle, establishing this is the system under the Constitution. He said the several states composing the United States of America are not united on a principle of unlimited submission to their general government, but that by compact, under the style and title of a Constitution for the United States and of amendments thereto, they constituted a general government for special purposes, delegated to that government certain definite powers, reserving each state to itself the residuary mass of right to their own self-government. This is really just reiterating so many of the foundational principles of the American Revolution that go all the way back to the arguments against the writs of assistance, the response to the Stamp Act, Jefferson's summary view, the Declaration of Independence, really, when you think about it, because ultimately it is the people of the several states who hold sovereignty or final authority, and when government goes beyond those limits, it's up to the people to keep the government in check, and if things get really bad consistently for a long time, it's the right and duty of the people to alter or abolish. So we can see these principles running through them. And you can also, even though he was a notorious flip-flopper, and he really, really loved big centralized government, but you could see these same kind of principles from Alexander Hamilton a few times as well. Here he is in Federalist number 33, talking about the Supremacy Clause, not creating a system where the government, the general government, would be supreme in all cases whatsoever. That was the system that Hamilton actually wanted during the Philadelphia Convention, and I think he secretly worked to undermine things to create that kind of system afterwards. But when he needed to convince the people in New York to ratify, and that's what the Federalist Papers were, they weren't very influential outside of New York State whatsoever until after ratification. So they didn't have much impact on the original legal meaning of things. But when Hamilton needed to explain things, he explained the things to the ratifying convention in New York, the people of New York, in the same way that everybody else was explaining it, that the federal government would be restricted to limited powers. As Madison put it in the Federalist 45 as well, the federal government would have powers that are few and defined. Those are reserved to the states, are numerous and indefinite. And talking about the Supremacy Clause, arguing with various anti-federalists, saying, well, you're creating a situation where they're going to do whatever the heck they want all the time. And he's like, no, this is absurd. He said it will not follow from this doctrine of supremacy, that is, that acts of the large society, which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, but which are invasions of the residuary authorities of the smaller societies, will become the supreme law of the land. So only those things that are in pursuant of the delegated powers of the Constitution are supreme. Everything else, Hamilton told us, is an act of usurpation. This is a theft of power from the sovereign people of the several states. He said these will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. Man, when Hamilton was on, he was on. It's too bad he ended up using his mouth and pen and everything else and his intellect for the wrong goals, which is massive, massive government in many situations. But certainly when he was explaining this, he's really telling the people, like, this is a theft of power. How do you treat a robber? Well, you definitely don't comply with everything that they say unless it's a threat to your life. You may have to do it. But in general, you have to have the mentality that as soon as they go beyond their limits, it's not about asking them to determine if they went beyond their limits. It deserves to be treated as a theft of power. And we see all through the revolution, there's, of course, a ramp up, but it starts out with you are not bound to yield obedience. Now, that doesn't mean that the federal court system is going to agree with that. That's not an argument to make to the government to beg them. But certainly when enough people refuse to comply, resist, and nullify, then they will be treated as they're supposed to be treated. Now, I should point out, as I'm getting through this, that all of these original source documents that I'm mentioning, plus a couple of other episodes, I've got articles by Mike Meharry, maybe something else I'll figure out in my notes as we go through this episode. They're all going to be linked to in a blog post. We publish that a couple of hours after the live stream is done. Alan Mosley gets that organized. That way you can say, oh, Bolden, you're like just flying through these quotes. Where can I find this and this and this? Generally, we have it organized kind of in the order that I go through it in each episode, and we'll get that published a couple of hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. That way you can read and learn more in context on your own time rather than just getting a highlight reel as I'm blasted through it here today. I also want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. There's Lee Deming. Good to see you, and we really appreciate the efforts and work that you're doing in Montana. There's Al, Diana, Howard, Brewster, Melody, Dixie, Senator DT, Loanoka Harbor, and a bunch of other people. Again, thank you so much for watching. I know I skipped over a few people, but I want to get right back to this content here as well. Now, back to Thomas Jefferson here. Of course, one of the main pillars, one of the main principles behind all these foundational views is the position that government is really only supposed to be a servant or an agent or a trustee of the people, or in the constitutional system, of the people of the several states. They're the ones who hold sovereignty or final authority. In the British system, the British claimed that they held final authority. And in essence, they took the position that the king in Parliament, which represented the will of the king, can do no wrong. So whatever the Parliament decides is the limit of Parliament's power, is constitutional, according to the British. And that, of course, was a system of total tyranny, and the founding generation understood this very well. And here's Jefferson in his summary view reminding us of this important principle. He said, kings, even kings are the servants, not the proprietors of the people. Jefferson, again, he didn't invent this. And when he talked about drafting the Declaration of Independence years later, he's like, I'm not trying to get anything new here. I wasn't trying to cover new ground, but express to the world the American mind, the views of the people that were widely held and understood. And he took that kind of position all through his career. Here from Thomas Gordon, very influential publications on the founders and the old revolutionaries in the early part of the 18th century, Cato's Letters, number 15. Here's how Gordon put it. The administration of government is nothing else but the attendance of the trustees of the people upon the interest and affairs of the people. Well, that's how it's supposed to be, but certainly it isn't how it's played out, because the people have allowed so many other things to happen as well. But here's how John Jay, first Chief Justice, described the same thing for the Constitution of the United States as well. He said, the Constitution only serves to point out that part of the people's business which they think proper by it to refer to the management of the persons therein designated. TLDR, government is only an agent of the people of the several states, and they have determined how much power they want that government to have in order to do things that they have decided they want government to do, and everything else is off limits. George Mason, this is also very prominent, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was so influential, not just during the Revolution, but in the years to follow and the decades and around the world, really. George Mason put it like this: all power is vested in and consequently derived from the people. Magistrates are their trustees and servants, and at all times amenable to them. Well, they're supposed to be, again. But the logical flow from this is, if the people are in charge and government is supposed to be your agent, then if government makes the determination about how much government power government has, and it's not up to the people to make that determination, then the created is greater than the creator, and that's absurd. And even Alexander Hamilton again understood this here in Federalist number 78. He said, there is no position which depends on clearer principles than that every act of a delegated authority, contrary to the tenor of the commission under which it is exercised, is void. No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid. Now, certainly he's arguing in this one, in Federalist 78, if you really want to understand the whole thing, he's arguing about how the judiciary needs to be independent and the judiciary has to do a particular job. But the underlying principle is that soon as government goes beyond the limits of the Constitution, those acts are void. And every act beyond the contrary to the Constitution is invalid. He said to deny this would be to affirm that the deputy is greater than his principal, that the servant is above his master, that the representatives of the people are superior to the people themselves, that men acting by virtue of powers may do not only what their powers do not authorize, but what they forbid. So Hamilton was really, really good at explaining that. And Jefferson took the same kind of position. It's so fascinating to see these two men who are at odds in so many areas, but having the same view of underlying principles as well. Here's Jefferson again in 1798. He said, the government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself. I mean, when you think about it like that, oh, the government gets to determine the limits of its own power. Well, that sounds dumb. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. And that's exactly what Thomas Jefferson said, because that would have made its discretion and not the Constitution the measure of its powers. So it's people, Constitution, government, and government at any level. Of course, James Madison in Federalist 46, I was thinking of including this as well. He points out that all governments at any level are really just merely agents or trustees of the people. And Meharry sums it up like this. The bottom line is that the federal government is a servant of the people of the states, their agent and nothing more. And as the saying goes, no servant is greater than the master. And he cited Patrick Henry, said the governing persons are the servants of the people. Because of that, again, if you're thinking about power flowing from the people, the master is in charge. The master determines if the servant has violated the rules. Unfortunately, for the servants, they don't really get a say if enough people of the states decide that they are wrong. And Mercy Otis Warren put it like this: the origin of all power is in the people, and they have an incontestable right to check the creatures of their own creation. On Friday's episode, I discussed Samuel Adams on his birthday, his great essay as Candidus in the Boston Gazette in 1771, and he had one of my favorite statements on this. He said, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. So if you think about, well, if government is way beyond its limits, I mean, that's an understatement, 24/7, 365, it's constantly usurping power all the time, just the very existence of the ATF, the DEA, and so many other so-called federal agencies that never should have existed in the first place. Just their very existence. These people should get a job rather than usurping power, because that's not really a job when they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing in the first place. So this is, the people themselves have the power to keep it in check. It's just that if they don't love freedom and they don't know how or are not willing to defend it, then you're not going to be free. And that's basically what Samuel Adams was getting at. Now, St. George Tucker really, in his view of the Constitution of the United States, 1803, really summed up this whole view of delegated and reserved powers, of nullification, declaring things null, and what's supposed to be done about it, really better than most. And he said, acts of Congress to be binding must be made pursuant to the Constitution. Otherwise, they are not laws, but a mere nullity, or what is worse, acts of usurpation. So then what's the logical result? It's the same position that Jefferson and so many others held going back decades. So this was written in 1803. It's reiterating the positions that Jefferson took in 1798, that he took in 1774, that we can take all the way back to John Adams and earlier in 1765. He said the people are not only not bound by them, but the several departments and officers of the governments, both federal and state, are bound by oath to oppose them. So as soon as the government goes beyond its limits, it's not about what we hear most politicians say today. Well, yeah, what we should do is work on a repeal, and we got to let the courts sort this out, which is we got to let part of the government tell us whether the government itself is supposed to stop doing what the government was never supposed to do in the first place. Again, this is a system of unlimited power. This is not what a free people does. This is a population on its knees, basically begging for scraps. And Tucker continued with this. For being bound by oath to support the Constitution, they must violate that oath whenever they give their sanction, by obedience or otherwise, to any unconstitutional act of any department of the government. Now, this is the kind of stuff that I never, ever even heard the tiniest whisper of when I went through the government-run school system, when I went through private schools and grade school. I never heard any of this. I don't know about you. I don't think they teach any of this stuff about these foundational principles. And that's why we work so hard every single day to reach and teach more and more people about these foundational principles, about how to keep the government in check when it refuses to do so. And that is a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. And absolutely nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us today. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment to say thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us as members lately. There's Diane in Tennessee, William in New Hampshire, Sean in California, Krista in South Carolina, Paul in Washington State, and Richard in Michigan. I know I missed a bunch of other people, but I'm so grateful for you putting your financial faith behind our work. If you're not able to pitch in financially, no sweat. You can also help us spread the word. A handful of free and easy peasy ways to do that. You can smash a like button, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. Please consider subscribing, getting notifications, leaving comments in the archive. All those things can give us a little algorithm bump, especially on the mainstream platforms, and tell them to show us to more people. Again, I really appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you had an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next time here on the Path to Liberty.